Hi, Ozzy here. This video was prompted by an interesting question posted publicly by the YouTuber ArguingFromIgnorance on his GooglePlus page. The question he posed was, if there's something God won't ever do, then surely this is functionally identical to something God can't physically do. Thoughts? So here are my thoughts. Let me begin by putting aside the word physical here, because I think that, strictly speaking, talk of something God can't physically do is an ontological category error, unless one thinks God is a physical being to begin with, which most monotheists would deny. Now, in his question, ArguingFromIgnorance understands that God is allegedly non-physical, which is why he asks if the claim that God would never ever do something is functionally equivalent to saying that he's physically unable to do it. I take his question to be asking if the statement that God would never do a certain thing isn't nevertheless an incapacity, even if strictly speaking it's not a physical incapacity. Is there not something that limits or obstructs or prevents God from doing certain things if he would never ever do something? Does the fact that God would never do something not imply that he's, in some sense, incapable of doing that thing? Now, a non-physical God would, by hypothesis, be a metaphysical being, literally a being outside or beyond the physical, whatever that means exactly. But there could nevertheless be metaphysical and or logical reasons that block him from doing certain things. When it's claimed that a being, such as a God, won't ever carry out some immoral act, such as lying or deceiving, this does not imply that this being lacks the capacity to carry out an immoral act. To say that one won't or refuses to do something is simply to state that the action, though logically and or metaphysically possible for that being to carry out, has been decided against. Now, we routinely, when speaking of moral decisions, adopt the language of compulsion. We often, when acting morally and according to the dictates of one's conscience, speak as if we are compelled, dictated by our conscience, we sometimes say. For instance, in the apocryphal tale of George Washington chopping down his father's cherry tree, when asked who did the deed, young George begins his confession with the words, "I cannot tell a lie." And when Martin Luther appeared before Emperor Charles V to defend what he taught and written theologically, he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." But we all understand that this sort of talk is meant to signify that one's actions are nevertheless undertaken deliberately and intentionally, despite the knowledge that one could, under relevantly similar circumstances, do otherwise. When we say, "I had no choice, I had to do the right thing," we're not literally claiming that another course of action was impossible to us for any logical or physical or metaphysical reason, but rather we're using the concept of had to or could not do in its normative sense, in the sense that we felt some moral obligation to do it, or to not do it. This is to say that we could not have done otherwise or did what we did, given our objective of doing the right thing. Such talk is a shorthand way of saying, given that I value doing the right thing, this was the only option consistent with that objective. So I had to do what I did to act in accordance with that objective. I didn't have to act in accordance with that objective, but given that I wanted to act consistently with that objective, this is what had to be done. So we don't mean that one literally had no options, could not choose, or could not undertake some other course of action. In fact, it's precisely the fact that other options were available to us and we did not choose them that makes doing the right thing so commendable when we do it, especially when it's inconvenient to do so. So in principle, one can imagine a being which, though it could do wrong things, only ever chose to do the right thing because it values doing the right thing. There's no contradiction in imagining a being which, though it could do all sorts of bad things, nevertheless always chooses the moral course of action. So my answer to his original question is, in short, no. To posit a God which always does the right thing in no way necessitates that it couldn't do the wrong thing, provided we are positing that the being in question is choosing to do the right thing and isn't, for some other reason, blocked from doing otherwise. But there is, I think, a very important point behind arguing from ignorance's question. I suspect that what motivates this question is that many theists, in their apologetics, often say something rather peculiar when trying to defend the claim that their God is omnibenevolent or all good. For instance, many apologists will say that the reason their God would never ever lie is that their God is, by his very nature, truthful and honest and non-deceptive. Deception, they say, violates his very nature. Some will even go so far as to say that God is truth itself. If God is by his very nature truthful and non-deceptive, then of course that would explain why we can trust that he won't ever lie, because nothing can violate its own nature. Everything can only act according to its own nature. The nature of a thing is what defines what its capacities and limits are. Everything is what it is and not some other thing. And if God is defined as having a nature that renders it literally impossible for him to do wrong, contradictory to do wrong, literally unimaginable that he could do wrong, then that would certainly explain why God won't ever do wrong, right? Setting aside that this is a vacuous conception of goodness for the moment, the difficulty here for those who avail themselves of this apologetic is that because they're not content to say God could lie or deceive or be dishonest, because he's a good being, because he values the good, he chooses, despite his ability to do otherwise, to do the good, and to only do the good, they instead naively seek to explain his omnibenevolent actions by stating that it's literally an impossibility that their God could carry out an immoral action. And they then try to justify this impossibility by appealing to some alleged omnibenevolent nature, which their God cannot violate. God doesn't choose to do the good, he just does the good. But if this God can't, because of his very nature, do otherwise, then that's literally something he cannot do. That really is a limit on his capacity to act. It quite literally means there are actions he cannot carry out which another being could carry out, such as ourselves when we carry out immoral actions. When apologists resort to this apologetic, they secure an explanation for their God's omnibenevolence at the expense of his omnipotence. One would think that saying a God could do immoral acts but chooses to never do them because he values what is good would be satisfactory for anyone who believes his or her God to be omnibenevolent. After all, that would still mean that their God is omnibenevolent, as a being that always chose to do that which is good, despite the ability to do immoral acts, would still only ever be doing the right thing. What more could one want from an omnibenevolent being? But apologists often overreach, and this is just such a case. Unsatisfied with a God that will only ever choose the good, they strive to divorce from their God the very concept of doing immoral acts, the mere possibility, not just the actuality, but the possibility of doing immoral acts. It's as if they think that saying it's impossible for God to undertake an immoral action would pollute their God as much as saying that he does commit immoral actions. And so they try to insist that the reason why their God is good is that it's literally impossible for him, because his very nature makes it such that he can only do what is good. As they see it, the very suggestion that their God could, not would, but could do an immoral action is seen as a contradiction. Thus they seek to guarantee their God's omnibenevolence at the expense of his omnipotence, since it would mean there are things that God simply cannot do, which is different from saying that he could do them, but won't do them. And there is an additional irony here. Given that such a being, if it's unable, literally unable, to do anything other than the good, then it would lack what most of these apologists would otherwise insist is necessary for a being to be a moral agent in the first place: moral autonomy, and the capacity to choose to do what is good because one values that which is good. This apologetic reduces their God to a kind of moral automaton. Okay, thank you for listening, and I hope this helps.